James Loeffler, Jay Berkowitz Professor of Jewish History at the University of Virginia, where he teaches courses in Jewish history and European history, Russian and Eastern European history, international and legal history, and history of human rights, as you know from reading excerpts from his superb book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, which received a number of distinctions, as did his prior book, The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire. His work is really erudite and scholarly, but it's also accessible and readable and bridges academia and public discourse, which I think is just so important to have authoritative, incredible scholars like Jim who can speak beyond the academy, and also to have academics with their feet in the world beyond academia. We were very much looking forward to meeting Jim in person in Washington, D.C., but are so grateful to be connected in this way, Jim, with you, and I'm also grateful for the conversations we've had since the summer, and this is a great culmination of those things. So please take it away.
Thank you, Jake. I want to thank all of you for coming to learn with me. I am a big fan of this fellowship program and the commitment that all of you make to it in your busy lives to kind of learn outside of your communities in this special way. So what I want to do with you today is talk about the themes that kind of power the book I wrote, and some of you got a chance to look at parts of it. And I really want to share with you a story and some questions. And the goal here is in our session for me to kind of frame some questions, tell you a little bit of backstory, give you kind of a taste of some of the history that's inside the book, and then leave a generous amount of time for us to process, discuss how these things play out. More specifically, I'm going to share my screen in a second and walk you through a little bit of a story. But I basically want to try and talk to you about how we think as Jews about global justice and how we thought about it in the past, right after World War I, how we thought about it in this moment of right after World War II and the birth of the State of Israel, and how we think about it today. So the goal for me will be to share with you sort of the story of, as I put it, of 1918 and 1948, and then to turn to the present and think with you about the questions of what the story looks like today and what it should look like today. And I do this, as you know, as you hear from the introduction. So I'm a history professor. So I really always want to explain what happened and why. I'm someone who also likes to live inside the world of Jewish thought and understand things in terms not bounded by time. But a lot of what you'll hear is me trying to explain how people thought in their moment forward. And I think that can be helpful for us, even if we search today in other ways with other resources that they didn't necessarily use. So let me start now by sharing my screen and get right into it. And I will, hold on. Let's play from the start. Okay, so you should all be seeing this, and hopefully you see, do you see me in the corner? Some version of me? Yes, you do. Okay, great. So here's the presentation, right? And the title of this is The Right to Be Heard. And I'm going to explain what that means in a second. But first, I'm going to start with a story. For those of you who are able to look at the introduction to my book, this will be a little familiar, and you'll hear me tell it again in my own words briefly right now. So as a historian, when I was interested in human rights, a topic that's really never been more timely for us, that raises hard questions for us living inside the United States, with connections to the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, investments, questions, responsibilities. So I wanted to understand how we got here. And my search began by looking back at a region I knew well, which is Eastern Europe, where so much of what we think of as the modern stuff of Jewish political life and even religious life emerged from. So the story I tell begins in 1918, right after World War I has ended. And as you see from this map, it's a region which is the borders, if you know nothing about this, the borders are shifting. The old empires are crumbling, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in their place is a new set of countries emerging, in some cases re-emerging, and a very contested border zone. The war, World War I is over, but into that space pour all these different armies and movements and leaders and warlords seeking to claim territory. And at the center of this is this city known today as Lviv, known in Polish as Lvov, and in German and Yiddish as Lemberg. And it's a border city right in between all these different clashing zones of influence and power. And why this is important is because after the war is over, there's essentially, you could call it a civil war between Ukrainians and Poles, different armies trying to claim this city as part of their countries that are emerging, and the Jews are caught in the middle. And as the Jews are caught in the middle, all the Jews of this city have to decide what to do as this war is raging around them, including the Zionists involved, who are young people committed to the Zionist movement, dreaming of a homeland, but also wanting to define themselves as a people in Europe. And they all try and stay neutral. And neutrality is taken by each side as a betrayal. If you're neutral, it means you're not with us. And if you're not with us, you're with them. And the net result of this is a pogrom. And the pogrom, as I described it in the book, takes place over 3 days in the city when Polish forces sweep in and they begin to almost indiscriminately attack the Jews of the town, of the city. And they begin to attack them viciously and to destroy synagogues, shops, homes. It's a story that probably most of you have heard before about violence in Eastern Europe and pogroms. And what is striking for me is, first of all, how radical and horrible this seemed at the time, right? Just imagine, people have just lived through World War I. They've lived through decades of violence against Jews, right? It's not a new story, but this violence is seen to be so terrible that the world pauses and asks, does Poland deserve to have its own country, or are these people too barbaric in the way they treat their own minority to be given the privilege of freedom? And the giving has to do with what's happening a couple hundred miles to the west in Paris, where the nations of the world, most of them, and most importantly, the great powers, the United States, England, France, Italy, are sitting together to divide up the map of Europe and to decide what the world should look like and how do you prevent another world war, and so on and so forth. And they debate this pogrom that happened because it's seen as so barbaric and so horrible. And in this shot here on the screen, you're seeing a protest in London in response to it, and then you're seeing a scene of some of the damage afterwards. So, okay, now I'm going to tell you more about how Jews reacted to it and why that's connected to thinking about global justice and thinking about human rights. But as I said to you, I want to give us some framing questions. So during this brief presentation, you have something to think about as I narrate to you, and then we can pause and really talk together about how these could be questions we grapple with today. Normally, when people talk about Jews and justice, I think everyone goes back to the famous quote from Rabbi Hillel, right? Which is, if I'm not for myself, who will be? You know, if I'm only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? And it's framed in terms of sort of, what are my obligations, right? What do I owe the world? Either in the sense of mitzvot, I owe the world this because I'm commanded, or I feel a sense of ethical responsibility as a Jew, and how far does that extend, right? And what does that mean I need to do now? My questions that I used for writing this book are different, and they are the following, and I hope you can see them here. These are questions that surfaced in 1918, and they surfaced in 1948, and they surface again for us today as we face anti-Semitism, as well as other kinds of injustice that we feel called to respond to and address. So my questions are these, right? They're about the who, the what, and the we. When we ask for justice, who do we want to hear us, right? When we often say the world must do something, right? So the who is really important, and it sometimes doesn't get as much attention. We think, what must I do? What are I called to do? But who do we want to hear us? Do we want it to be our government? Do we want it to be all kinds of good governments? Do we want it to be the bad governments? Do we want it to be people like us, right? Where do we think? Do we want it to be an international court or United Nations? And the who is important in thinking about what I call the architecture of our world of justice. Number two, what kind of justice do we seek? Meaning, and this is one of the hardest questions for us now, still living through a war happening in Afghanistan, in theory winding down, a war in Iraq, in theory winding down, and other wars, right, and conflicts that we're party to and part of. So what kind of justice do we seek? Do we seek armies to go in and do something? Do we seek lawyers and courts to do something? What is it that we want to ask for the people who we see in need of justice and for ourselves, right? And one other way of putting this is, what's the ask? What are the rights we want? What does it mean to ask for justice? And number three, perhaps obviously, but just as important, who is the we, right? When we ask for this, are we asking as Americans? Are we asking as Jews? Are we asking as members of a Jewish community, a global one, a local one, right? These are questions many of us experience every day in our lives. And these are really important questions for historians to try and understand how justice claims were made 100 years ago. So now, let me tell you that as you probably have a sense of from the book and from my spiel so far, I went looking for this and I found it in the careers of these people. There are lots of people in this book. The people I focused on were 5 men because they were all involved in pursuing what I would call legal approaches to it, dreaming of what international law could do, should do, and couldn't do in facing these questions of justice for the world. And the person I'm going to use to illustrate this story briefly for you is Hirsch Lauterpacht. Now, I could tell you a lot about him, but suffice it to say, to keep our conversation moving, the most important thing you have to know about him is he is regarded today by the experts as the greatest international lawyer of the 20th century. And that is because he dreamed up many of the things that we consider kind of the building blocks of international law, including the idea of crimes against humanity. That's his idea. The idea of an international Bill of Human Rights, which basically became the UN's human rights system. All kinds of things involving military justice too, and that you cannot blame a crime just on the fact that I was following orders. That was his idea, as well as other things about just how we think about what countries are and how they function. And he ended his career, he began it in Poland, as we'll see, and he ended his career on the International Court of Justice in The Hague, in the Netherlands. He was also an active participant in the Zionist movement and involved in giving legal advice to his fellow Zionists throughout the decades up to 1948, and during that year helping to draft what became the Israeli Declaration of Independence. So it's interesting, his story. And in the book, I talk a lot about human rights and Zionism and things like that. I'm happy to talk more to you all about it. But for our purposes, what is interesting to me is what was his response when he lived through that pogrom that I just described to you. So he was there and he faced the same questions that I framed, right? Which is to say, who do we ask to be heard? And what do we want for justice? And who is the we? So Lauterpacht was a young Jew. He was a teenager at this point in time who had lived through the war and was living in the city when this violence was happening, was part of a self-defense brigade. And afterwards, he was involved in formulating response. And what I felt striking to me from the moment I began to explore his life and his early years was that he didn't say what we might think, right? He didn't say, give us equality or stop the violence or, we want justice. He asked for very specific things. He wrote to the Polish army, effectively, and the Polish government that was beginning to take control. And he said, we want to be treated as equals and we want to be treated as Jews. And he said, the only just recompense we could ask for after this violence is not just equality, which he does want, what we would call like equal rights, civil rights. But he said, we want separate schools. We want the rights to have our own culture and religion preserved. We want the government to recognize us as a nation living inside Poland, as well as Polish citizens. And we want minority rights for us as a national minority. And so he said, we need to demand from the people who've just wronged us that they give us this recognition as a people inside this country to give us justice. Now, surprise, he didn't really get that. And then he said, well, if I don't get that, what am I going to do? And the answer is, if you don't get that, then you seek justice somewhere else and you seek to be heard by someone else, somewhere else. And this is where, as I tell it, he begins to think about what we now recognize as international law and international human rights. Because he says, if they won't give it to us, let us appeal to the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the precursor to the United Nations. international organization. All the big powers have joined. The US was helped design it, doesn't join. The most important part of this is he says, let's go above the heads of this country and let's demand that this organization be responsible for guaranteeing our justice. And the way he does that, and the thing that's very striking for us today is he says, first, let's get the students to mobilize. So he organizes and launches an organization which is still around. It's not as well known in the United States today. It's one of the reasons I was curious if anyone here is from outside the US. In Canada, other parts of the world, it's still an organization. There are others. We have BBYO, other organizations that we recognize as kind of global Jewish youth groups and youth organizations. This is the World Union of Jewish Students. He launches it. Before he's a world famous lawyer, and before he's really even known as a legal thinker or activist, he's a student activist. And he says, we need to get students from every country together to fight anti-Semitism in Poland and in other countries, and to be able to make an appeal as a Jewish people and the youth of it, to the international body of the League of Nations to give us rights, to recognize us, and to give us guarantees for who we can be as a people. So we need to be heard by the world, but that doesn't just mean people all over it. It means specifically the powerful people and diplomats who now run this organization and who are creating the borders of this country. A long story short, organization thrives, and he goes on from there to a career in international law. And he goes on from there to say, after 1918, that what we want in terms of from the international community is we want to be recognized as a nation inside the borders of the country of Poland, the country of Czechoslovakia, the country of Lithuania, all this belt of countries that are emerging in Eastern Europe. And therefore, we want to have these same kinds of rights. We want to have government to support our schools. We want them to recognize our language as an official language in this country, and so on and so forth. But he's also a Zionist, and his Zionism also means he wants a national homeland. So when the League of Nations says, oh, we're going to actually give the Jews the promise of a homeland, we're going to recognize Palestine as something for the Jewish people, and the something is often, as you probably know, contested exactly what that means. Is it a real promise of a state? Is it a refuge? What kind of promise is it? But it's real. And so he looks at that and the British mandate in Palestine, and he says, yes, now we have a structure where international law gives Jews exactly what we need. Those in the diaspora have the protections from anti-Semitism, which means not just equality, but a respect and a recognition of our collective identity. And those who are going to go to Palestine and rebuild the land of Israel as a Jewish nation, those people will have also international law recognizing it. It is interesting to think about his own biography. Many of us, as we think about sort of where we are in our lives, would we move somewhere, would we stay? He's torn. At least 3 times he tries to leave Eastern Europe and move to Palestine. He marries a young woman from Jerusalem. He's very drawn to it as a place. But in the end, he makes a career for himself in Europe and ultimately in England, where he gets a job at Cambridge, a wonderful academic job. So he does that. But he continues to be connected to what is emerging in the Middle East and that story. Okay, so if in 1918, the answer I gave to my questions really was, we need to be heard by not just the world, but we want international law and the legal authorities at the League of Nations to hear us. And the what is, we want not just a claim to territory somewhere, but we want to be recognized legally as a minority group and with rights that go with it. And the who is a Jewish people. And for this man, Lauterpacht, and many like him, it means thinking of Jews as basically an ethnic nation. People may be religious and people may not be religious. And here I'll just break my own rules as a teacher and go back in my slides and show you that the World Union of Jewish Students, he says, I want it to be Klal Yisrael. I want it to encompass all Jews. They can be religious or non-religious, Orthodox, Reform. They can be Zionist or non-Zionist, but they all should be connected into something that will all be linked together, right? So it was a dream of unity, and the law was supposed to help with that. So what happens after that? The answer is the Shoah, right? The destruction of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, World War II, an intensification of the conflict between Jews and Palestinians, right, in British Mandatory Palestine, all kinds of different schemes for how to resolve that conflict. And in the end, when the dust clears to some extent, right, the world now has something called the United Nations, and they are trying to develop what we would recognize today as international human rights, building on these same ideas that Lauterpacht and others had articulated. And they're also saying, okay, let's finally get rid of these problems of these border conflicts in places like Eastern Europe and India and the Middle East by creating new countries. So let's create a Jewish state and an Arab state. And this, as you may know, is the plan of partition, right? Two states that was intended to be in 1947. The details of it are very interesting and they're always worth learning. And here's my pitch to you as students. It's always worth learning more about them because it's amazing how complex and how much possibility there was in these moments, even if in retrospect, it seems like it was destined to play out a certain way. For Lauterpacht, as I told you at the beginning, he promotes this idea of human rights. And he actually says, we now need to build the legal system that will protect everybody, and the UN will be able to protect everybody. And we need to build this Jewish state that he's dreamed of. And that's therefore he's involved in both of these stories. I'm going to leave you now with this section by passing very quickly to what happens when he takes his first visit to Israel after 1948. Because I think it's a moment where we can see both the stories I've been sketching out for you, as well as the questions as they crystallize once again. And again, the questions are about, the right to be heard and what does that look like, who does it, and what is the ask there. So in 1950, Lauterpacht goes to Israel, and he goes there to speak, to give 2 lectures at the Hebrew University. And the lectures are about international human rights. And I put up on the screen a little map so you can see the status of things at that point in time, right? The West Bank has just been annexed by Jordan. So it is not perfectly clear what is going to happen with the claims to an Arab-Palestinian state, but there is still shooting across that border into Jerusalem, which is a divided city. There is an Israel, of course. And all of Lauterpacht's old cronies have assembled, his old friends from Eastern Europe, who are now leaders in this new Israeli government, to hear him speak. And here you see the advertisement in Hebrew for the Tochnit, right, that he's going to give a couple lectures to celebrate the anniversary of the university. That's what the Hebrew language document there is. And the most important thing about this is his theme is the right to be heard. And he comes and he says, it is so important and inspiring to me that Jews are in the lead of building international justice and that Israel is involved in this endeavor because it's a member, it's part of this community, it's going to be part of the United Nations, and it is going to be able to push forward the cause of human rights. But then he says, there's a challenge facing us and there's a challenge facing human rights and by extension, justice. And he says, we have not necessarily built yet all the treaties and covenants and the law and the court and all the things that we might wish to see for there to be global justice. And he actually says, I'm quite disappointed. Not disappointed, he says, in Jews, but he says, I'm disappointed in the great powers and the way they built the UN, that the United States and the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, they don't actually seem as generous in their view of what human rights are and how much they're willing to commit to it and so on and so forth. And so they haven't done all the legal work they should have. That's a question we still argue about and hear a lot about today. But he says the most important thing is the right to be heard. And by that he means the United Nations should have the right to hear from any individual around the world who feels that her or his rights are violated. And that should be the address you go to. And at least the world can hear, and you can have an official location that will hear all of these petitions, these requests for help, and they can broadcast them, and then they can investigate them and study it, right? And he says, this is the most important right, the most important human right, the right to be heard. And then he goes on to say in his remarks, this is crucial. And all around the world, people have begun to mail letters in to the United Nations address in New York. And those letters need to be investigated, but right now they're not, because the diplomats at the United Nations have said, we don't know if it's too sensitive. We don't have the legal authority to investigate all these complaints because we will anger the Soviets or anger the Americans or anger the Saudis or anger the Israelis. We can't do this. So until all the countries agree that we're allowed to open the letters, literally, and read the complaints and hear these voices, we're actually going to just file them away. And believe it or not, today, as we sit here talking about this, those letters, those petitions are still sitting in archives and they're not open. No one's ever been allowed to investigate them because they're too sensitive. So in 1950, Lauterpacht says to his audience, this is a shanda, right? This is a disgrace that this is happening. And he says, what I think is countries have to take the lead and countries have to push forward to let everyone be heard. And then he turns to his audience and says, I think Israel should be taking the lead, start a campaign, jumping in. And afterwards, as I talk about in the book, he has an argument with his friends, his now Israeli friends, who say, great idea, Hirsch, but we're still in the midst of a conflict. Our borders are not settled. We have lots of difficult issues facing us, our security. We don't have a constitution yet. Maybe this is too great a risk for us to take, to go and to, as it were, in the theme of Passover, be the first to jump into the sea and take that plunge. Maybe we can't afford this, and you should know this. You're one of us. And he says, maybe that's the case. I'm not gonna judge you, but I would like to think that you would take extra risk on in order to let all of us be heard, and that you have the power to do this. And frankly, I think we're still hearing that debate today when we talk about Israel and we talk about human rights. What is the responsibility of Israel? What is the responsibility of the United States? What's the responsibility? And in every situation, right? When we also talk about justice in other places. And I'm going to conclude this part of my remarks just by putting back up these questions, right? And asking us to think together in the remaining minutes, and I'm happy to field your questions or just to think with you about them. What does it mean to be heard, right? And what does it mean to talk about that right today? In one sense, we're still in that 1948 moment because we're still asking, who do we seek justice from, right? Many of us would say we turn to our government, the United States government. Others would say we want something bigger and above it if we don't trust our government, or even if we do, to help other governments. And some would say the United Nations should provide it, and others would say, but it doesn't work the way it should. The what, I think, is really important too. And as you and I think about anti-Semitism in our world, there's a lot of debate about what kind of protection we want, right? Whether we want to be protected as individuals, treated exactly the same, or we want to say that anti-Semitism is something that needs to be recognized as a special kind of persecution and discrimination and needs certain things. And of course, this is the question that every Jewish educational session ends with, which is sort of, who is the we, right? What does it mean to talk about this? Our identity, what role does that play? Especially when it's not self-evident in a pluralist world about who the we is and if we don't want everything. So what I'm gonna now do is stop sharing my screen and turn back to you. And I've spoken for about half our time. And I hope we can use this time really to discuss these questions and other parts of the story that I can fill in without just talking at you too much more.
Thank you so much, Jim. Do you have a preference if do you want people to raise their hands or type something into chat?
Yeah. So why don't we start with typing into chat so so we can get going that way because there's a
And
lot of us.
I'll keep an eye on the chat and then can field it your way. But first of all, just thank you for this awesome presentation. And maybe just to kick off, as people are thinking about other questions, I was personally wondering as I was listening to you about this this vision, Hirsch Lauterbach's vision that seems to be prompted by trauma, by his own trauma. So what is it that that one can do to be heard by those who did not experience that trauma, to be heard by majorities? Why did he think that his vision will resonate with people whose experience is so different?
Right. That's a great question. I think, first of all, he was a lawyer, right? And lawyers believe that you convince people by analogy and by kind of universal principles, that I can argue with logic that if this holds here, it must hold here. So it was very important to him to say, I've experienced trauma, but that's not what I want to tell the world about, right? Other people reacted to that violence by saying, look what has happened to our people. The world should do something. We demand something. And what his argument was, in fact, was this is something that every people should get, right? Every people. And he was in a messy map of Europe where he said to the Poles, after all, you're not just the majority here building your own country. We know that there are actually lots of Polish people who you claim as kin who are living in other countries. They're now controlled by the Soviets. They're now living in Lithuania. They're living in other places. So just as we want something, we have a claim for dignity, you do too. And this is part of his appeal. This is also why he's what I would call an internationalist, not in thinking like global, we're all the same, but thinking, oh, there are groups like this all over the world, locally and elsewhere, who face the same question about making claims and being connected to people far away from them, feeling that. So this was important for him to say, it's not about just, this is also, I think, part of his message to the Polish government, right? It's not just you have wronged us. It's more how you can do right by us in the language that you recognize. And this is also something I'll just add in, which is the language of the nation. We don't all use that language today, right? Even those who identify strongly with Israel don't necessarily use the language of the nation. Sometimes we use the language of religion. But he says we live in a world in which empires are crumbling and people think of themselves as members of nations. And therefore, this will actually resonate with Greeks, and this will potentially resonate with Palestinians too, that everyone can speak the same language and therefore understand our claim and their claim. So I'm going to respond. There's a question here from Eden or Eden. I'd like to put a face with it. So now I have to scan through and see where you are.
Hi, I'm here.
All right. Say hi again so your face will pop up.
Hi, I'm Eden.
Hi, Eden. Okay. Yeah, so your question, which I think everyone can see, is how are the laws and human rights put out by international bodies like the UN supposed to be taken seriously when they're protected by their national sovereignty? And how can this be the case? What do we do for Jewish concerns, right? When there's a lot of bias inside the UN towards Israel and towards Jewish concerns. This is a great question. And if you're thinking about it in terms of the story that I told you, there's a tension built in, right? And the tension is really there in 1948. What is the best thing you can dream of if you want to give Jews protection after the Holocaust? Well, for this man Lauterpacht and for many Jews and for many non-Jews, the obvious answer is sovereignty. You need to give people not only a place to live securely, but the means to be secure. And that means this notion of national sovereignty, right? We control our borders. We control what's inside. And therefore, we don't want to be weakened by outside forces coming in and undermining our authority. At the same time, his dream was international law, which by its very nature means somebody has the authority to reach over the top and say, you, China, are doing something wrong, right? You're doing something wrong to the Uyghurs. You're doing something wrong to your own people or the people inside your borders or the people outside. And that is a tension. We don't get away from that tension. What I can say to you is this. He believed in sovereignty, but he said, sovereignty is not an all or nothing. He said, look at our world, look at our interdependence, look at it. And in fact, he's talking about a time when people are thinking about labor and migration and refugees and health. WHO, this is the moment when these organizations are being built. And he said countries should be willing to surrender a little bit of that sovereignty in order for the security of working together. Now, he believed that. One of the problems he confronted is that not every country buys into it to the same degree. And that takes us back to the question I left you with, which was his to his Israeli colleagues and their response, which is, why should we be Nachshon, to use a reference to Pesach, right? Nachshon is the person who jumps into the Red Sea, takes that risk. Why should we do that if other countries are not, right? And if, in fact, we also are in a conflict with peoples like the Palestinians who are not a country, and then we're not equal in that sense, right? I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's his answer was, if we get it right and we have a world where people are equal in their states, then it becomes easier to do. I don't think he would have anticipated we'd be in a world where there'd be so many failed states and so many stateless peoples and unresolved wars, right? He thought that we could get rid of a lot of that. As for bias in the UN, one of the things I try and do in the book is try and understand how that develops. And one of the strange things to recognize is at the beginning, in his time, the United Nations looked on Israel as actually a key ally. And they thought, you are a people who have an investment in global justice, and you're a small country. So you can't afford just to be able to say, we're going to rely on some great power to support us. And you can't just do it all with your army. So we're here to help. And over time, that didn't work out so well. And Israelis became more and more skeptical about it. And the UN had more and more trouble with the politicization of the legal system. So I don't have an easy answer for that. But I think it's clear that there was a hope that we could resolve that. Now, a bunch of people are jumping in and asking more about this. And these are really very interesting questions about the right to be heard in the UN and where does it get its authority. So much of the vision was that law could do something to stop the politics, right? And much of the vision today, for those who still believe in it, is to say, everything is political. We live in a political country, right? We live with political realities which intrude in really profound ways into our lives. But we still aspire to imagine our legal system as something which can be separate. It doesn't mean there's not going to be moments where things get political. But if we have a system that we all agree to, you get arrested, you agree to go to court. And then we argue about how to make the system fairer and how to make the law better. And for the people I'm writing about and the people who are still invested in it today, they basically say, don't give up on the system, just build it better, right? One of the remarkable things about Lauterpacht is that in 1950, even as he's talking to Israelis and saying, hey, do more on human rights, he's actually also saying to the UN, I'm disappointed in you. He says, it would have been better if we didn't jump into having all kinds of rights and beautiful organizations and names, and we just built more better law. Because as he says, it's the legal system which has to have the legitimacy. And what I think many of you are picking up on is that for many people today, and by the way, if I was speaking to a group of young Palestinians or people from the Arab world, many of them also have lost a lot of confidence in the UN, because they would say for themselves, they also experience a serious deficit of what they would consider to be attention on their needs, as well as kind of a neutrality. So there's a lot of great disappointment. The Jews are not, Jews are exceptional, yet they're not. And the issues today are really about, can you rebuild the legitimacy of that organization? Or do you have to look somewhere else for authority and legitimacy? So questions are flowing in, and I want to try and ask Molly's question, which is a really wonderful question about difference. Right? When we ask to be heard, when we ask for visions of a universal justice, what if we have very different visions about what that requires and what that looks like? This is, I think, one of the most interesting places where I would say Jews can contribute to a debate and a discourse today. There are a lot of ways in which we look at the story and we imagine that human rights is something universal, that the West builds it just like democracy. And then other countries come along and they say, wait a second, that conflicts with Islam and Sharia, or China comes along and says that conflicts with our values, or others say, you're focused too much on religious freedom. What about social equality, right? And I think actually that by virtue of the Jewish experience of being a people that's kind of caught in between the East and the West, a minority and now a majority because of Israel, that it gives us a chance to think about and the duality of our lives, right? That many of us live with multiple commitments and identities. It gives us an opportunity to think about this just as in a different way people did 100 years ago. And what I mean by that is it's often one of the biggest challenges that we see today is people's blindness, right, to others, like the notion of what justice means for people. And we see that in this country. And I think the doubleness of Jewish identity can help us sometimes to understand from this perspective of a country such as Israel that wants to maintain its borders, and then a country such as this one where we say, wait a second, what about the status of people trying to seek refuge here, right? We can understand it from both sides, and that's an asset to us. That's not going to make us come up with the miracle solution, but it's going to help attune us to how to think about it. Building off Jacob, I'm going to hit Sammy's question. Yeah, one thing I learned, so Sammy's question up there for everybody is really about what does the future of Jewish rights look like for the smaller communities in other countries who don't have the same institutional support within their country to even get to a place like the United Nations. This is a different world we live in, and I think that's a really important thing to ask and to think about. For starters, you're all students, you're all heading off towards post-high school experiences and thinking about what it means to go to university. Most of you will probably do that, right? In some way, shape, or form. And there's a huge debate these days about how to protect Jewish students, from anti-Semitism, what kind of threat it is. What is striking is, the debate is, what should our government do, right? We don't hear a lot of talk about what the UN should do or things like that. In places like France, in fact, France has also taken aggressive steps to address anti-Semitism, and the government has made these formal pledges to deal with it. And in fact, most of those smaller Jewish communities are turning to their own governments in one way or another and saying, you need to do something to help us. And they're not that different in America, even in Russia, which is a complicated place to live for Jews today. In some ways, Jews are saying, we want to be in good favor with Putin. We want to be in with power because we can take advantage of the fact that in this country, in Russia, for instance, there's much more hatred of Islam than there is of Judaism. There's a lot of anti-Semitism, but there's a way in which we are a safer bet. So what I'm saying to you is, we're now in a moment where people are saying, maybe we no longer look to the UN, and maybe we no longer look to international organizations. Maybe we just look to our government as the only way we can see it, and therefore we look in France to that as well.
Jim, if I can just step in for a second? Just as you pick the next question, it was really lovely to have the fellow who asked the question to say hello and put the question to the face. So just so we have a little bit of sense of community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So. Is it Ross? Oh, there you go. Ross, say hi.
Yeah, hi.
Hi there. So you want to just say your question out loud so we can let this be a little bit more interactive?
Yeah, you mentioned how Lauterpacht wanted Poland to recognize Jews as an ethnic minority within Poland.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering what you thought about that designation just in terms of Judaism as a whole, and also how that contributed or potentially contributed to anti-Semitic views within Poland and Eastern Europe in general.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And I think I'm going to give you an answer to it, and then I'm going to pivot and ask all of you to think about it today and how it might be seen for us. So there was a debate. One of the things I wanted to do in writing this book is not tell history the way, like, here's the hero and here's what he did. I wanted to show a world that looks a lot like ours in the sense that people don't agree. So his position was, we're not the same as an ethnic Pole, right? They're Catholic. They see themselves as different than us. We're not just a religious group. We're an ethnic group. That's how he understood Jewish identity in Poland. And so to make a claim is not to stir up separatism or not to make us more of a target or to mark us as disloyal. It's just to recognize the reality of our lived experience and then to say, we deserve this. Other people didn't agree. And many American Jewish leaders said, that is a bridge too far. If you do that, you're basically playing into the hand of anti-Semites who say the Jews, get out of Poland already, right? You want to have a homeland somewhere else? We'd love to get rid of you. And they said this well before the Holocaust. So that was a debate. And it was a debate about whether claiming that kind of what I would call a thick group identity is a necessary step towards justice and politics, or whether it can be also a trap. One of the interesting things about what I learned in looking at this history is this whole legal stuff, this whole system that I described to you, he was involved in making. So why didn't it help with the Holocaust, right? Why didn't it help prevent the rise of anti-Semitism before the Holocaust? And the answer is Polish Jews decided we don't actually want to take advantage of it. Because if we appeal to the League of Nations and ask them to investigate what our government is doing to us, we'll be marked as even more traitorous, and it'll be backfire. And therefore, we can't afford to do it. So that debate is there. And here I want to pivot and ask all of you to think about this, because as you may know, this is a debate we often think about when it comes to American law. And some of the recent steps to protect Jewish students, on the one hand, have been seen by many people as a necessary way to make sure people are protected. And other people have reacted. Some voices have reacted with saying, oh my God, wait a second, you're stamping us now as a race or as a nationality or as an ethnicity, which doesn't capture who we are and our identity. And also it's dangerous, right? And you hear this coming from voices in different parts of the political spectrum. So let me throw it out there and see if there are reactions to that or questions about that. How does it look different to you, and that double-edged sword about claiming that kind of group identity versus saying, no, we should be not emphasizing our status as different.
And folks, you can maybe wave or just like type
wave,
into a chat, and then Jim will call on you.
Yeah. I see anybody. Louis, are you jumping in? You flashed. You didn't flash, okay. I'm mastering Zoom here as we go. All right, instead, Davi wrote. Davi, where are you?
I'm right here. Hi.
Yeah, hi. So what if negative effects scenarios from specific Jewish lobbying? Yeah. Right. I mean, I think that your question is a great question. That is the question, right? How do we advocate as a collective without making us into something that erases the diversity within outside our Jewishness, but also plays right into the stereotypes, right? And that we see this all the time. Oh, the Jews are all this. Of course, the Jews are trying to silence that kind of thing. We don't live in the same world as 100 years ago, right? And we don't speak the same way about identity. And I think, fortunately for us, we face diversity is a positive reality, right? We're so different. The people I'm talking about lived in a world which was very complicated, but there was kind of us and them, right? And there's not just us and them today. One of the things I think we can do, and this is a lesson that they tried to do, and I think it's a valuable one, is try to form alliances. One of the risks that some of the people in this story were willing to take is to say, you know what, we're going to try and partner with people who we've had real differences with in the past, because some of those Poles, we have a lot of just trauma, right, and antipathy. But we're going to find members of the Polish society who we're going to take the risk with. We're going to reach out to other groups, Lithuanians, ethnic Germans. We're going to reach out to people where, even if part of their community is now beginning to become anti-Semitic, we're going to take the risk to reach out to this other part, because we can build a kind of alliance. And that's an interesting question for us today. How much risk are we willing to take? I think that, one way to think about it is to say, if you recognize in people also having multiple commitments, then you can use that as the basis to begin a conversation. And in some respects, and maybe some of you have experienced this, I mean, it is a lot easier actually to talk to people about issues in the Middle East sometimes if you frame it as we as Americans plus, we have commitments to life over there and to people, to family, right, over there in different ways. Or maybe we don't have direct commitments, but we feel responsible, and to talk to other groups inside American society. That is something that is a tactic and a risk to take that I think is worth doing. I can tell you, and I'll just speak personally, I teach at the University of Virginia. After the neo-Nazis came to town, we struggled as a community with how to respond. And there was a lot of hindsight 2020 vision about what should have been done. And then there was a big debate for Jewish students on campus. How do we build a coalition? Because in fact, the neo-Nazis are still there. There are still people, ideologues, and there's still court cases going on. There are still people trying to stir up trouble. And there was, and still is, a great debate about how to make alliances with other groups because of Israel, because of debates about Israel on campus, bleeding into Hillel life and other Jewish student life. And some students have said, because of that, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And others have said, we have to keep trying to find a common ground and recognize that we may have profound differences about the Middle East, but we also have a common threat here. And we can pursue this, and we can pursue this even as we acknowledge that we're not going to reach an agreement about the Trump administration's policies or the Israeli government or the EU and its attitude towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that's an endeavor to do, but it's very hard. And I talk to a lot of students who feel like I'd rather just find someone who just takes me, all of me as I am, and says, I'm with you. I like you, and I like what you stand for, and that those other people, forget about them. But that work of trying to figure out what an alliance can look like is essential today. And this also kind of speaks to Molly's question. Where are you, Molly? Yeah. Can you actually just elaborate for a second? We have a little bit of time left here, I think, and I'd love to hear your voice and just say what it means to be stamped as kind of a political pawn.
Okay, so when you asked about like opinions about, like, you're talking about Trump's executive order about Jewish students on college.
Yeah, I'm alluding to that, exactly.
I don't know. I feel like personally, like, I mean, I don't identify with like the BDS movement whatsoever, but I think that I felt like I was like given these sort of protections, but like in a way of sort of like using my identity in a way to like alienate maybe like other students on campuses, or like that you can use saying like, oh, I'm a Jew and I need protection to sort of like hurt others, or I don't know, like Trump can say he's protecting Jews and therefore like use that in his campaigning and in his strategy, right? Like without actually like giving the rhetoric and like compassion towards Jewish people that like allow them to be safe, right? Like he can say he's protecting Jews and like say he's protecting me, but like in his actions and in the stereotypes he invokes and everything else, like that doesn't feel true. But like, he can say it and then like allow him to be like Islamophobic, right? Or like in other ways, like use me against other people just because like he said that now I'm safe.
Right. Thank you for elaborating. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have a magic answer for that. I think that's a really powerful concern. It's a tricky one. I would say this. So I'm going to speak to you again as a history professor. I'm going to say that it's not a new situation. And one of the things you see if you look backwards in this story of Jews and human rights, the story of Jews and civil rights in this country, you see situations in which Jews become a symbol for and a pawn for interests. And the challenge is when they recognize that, but they still want to do good in the world, right? And they still want to protect themselves and help others. So immediately after this Polish situation, the Poles said, well, what's happening for us with the Jews shows that we can never truly have national independence, because we want to have a country here in the middle of Europe, but the rest of the world is saying, you're not treating the Jews nicely. And so the Jews are becoming a symbol of kind of, surprise, surprise, global cosmopolitanism, and so that we don't really get to have our own nation strong because we're being assaulted by the outside, by these liberal elites. And the language that they use is strikingly similar to some of the populist language you hear today. And so bottom line, the people inside this history knew that. And they were aware of that. They were aware of the stereotypes that were rising, that, oh, the Jews want to just to damage Polish sovereignty and national honor, and they want to use the law in unfair ways. They were also aware of the fact that people were saying, oh, the Jews are using the law unfairly to claim territory from the British and to do things like that. Long story short, that's not a new dilemma. And I think the goal has to be for all of us to be aware of it, but not to be cynical, not to become cynical such that we don't think how to ideate, how to imagine out of ourselves other identities. And so I want to kind of wind up just by addressing one last question here, which is Josephine's question, because it popped up in the last few minutes. And it gives me what every writer loves, which is a chance to refer back to the title of their book. But it's a question about rootedness, right? And what it means to be rooted when we talk about human rights. And human rights is a universal idea, right? And I called the book Rooted Cosmopolitans, and it has to do with a pun, Stalinism, anti-Semitism. You can look it up. But it's also because these are people who imagined themselves as part of a universal endeavor of justice, but we're very rooted, right? It's almost at first glance a paradox. So what I found striking is when we go looking for justice, we never just begin it as human. We always begin it in a place, right? We get it in a place in a city, as Americans, in a community, looking out, feeling what is my responsibility to that place, to those people, whether they're people I identify with or others, right? Or what should my government do to help them? There are ways in which we understand humanity as one thing, but when we live the experience, we start from the particular, where you're sitting, your family, your world, and so on and so forth. I think that's a very Jewish way to approach it. I think that's a way in which it's an act of both idealism and humility, because the idealism is imagining us out in a global world, because that's the way the world is. But the humility is understanding that I don't know exactly what the rest of the world needs, and I'm not going to assume I can jump immediately into their shoes, and I'm going to think outwards in a responsible, ethical way. I actually think that kind of takes us back to Hillel, where we started, and it kind of takes us back to some rabbinic ideas and some prophetic ideas about what is our vision of global justice. And it's a vision, I think, if you begin not with what does everyone need, but begin with what do we experience, and you reason outwards, I think you can get to an effective place. And what I see happening, I think, for Jews is this is an opportunity to do that, because we don't speak for global Christianity, because we're not big. We're not Islam, we're not Christianity, so where our religious ethics are about these massive visions of the world. We're always going to be small. We're always going to be constrained by size and sensitive to that. And that could give us, I think, a powerful ethical starting point to imagine justice in a world which is pluralistic, right? Where we're not all the same inside our community, and we're not all the same outside of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. This is really fascinating. We're gonna come back for processing in half an hour, but for the next little bit, we still have time. If you're not rushing off, Jim, maybe people can hang and just continue casually schmoozing and asking questions for the next little bit, and then hopefully we can take a break, and in half an hour, fellows, we should all be back, meet back on screen here, and we'll process.
Thank you. Well, let me just say, for those of you who are going to take break now, it's very nice to see all of you, get to talk with you a little bit. If I didn't get your question, Jake has my email. I'm very happy to write you an email back about it. Very happy to point you to other stuff if there's specific things. Some of you, clearly have a lot of specific interest about some of the legal stuff, about the UN. I have my opinions. I also happy to point you to other people who can be resources if you want to read up on it. So that's an open invitation. And then those who are going to stick around for a few minutes, I'm happy to talk some more. Abe, Abe, are you sticking around?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Hey.
So, hey there. So yeah, tell us your question. It's an interesting one.
Sure. So I actually, as I was thinking about it, I had a little bit of a revision to the question.
Okay.
I guess I'm interested in hearing what you think Lauterbach would say, both about people whose national identities change, nations whose identities change over time, and stateless peoples, and how that fits into a legal international paradigm that is so centered on nationhood and peoplehood.
Yeah. That's a really great question. I think that he was, he's not a hero for me. He's a really powerful, inspiring, interesting person. But he's not a simple hero. He had some contradictions about that. On the one hand, this guy was, when he was your age, he got up every day with a youth group before school to meet up, not to say Shachrit morning prayers, but to study Hebrew, because he was a Hebraist, right? And he believed in the language as something really powerful. What people like him did is they memorized the poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik, the great Hebrew poet. And that was, in a certain sense, his Torah, right? So he was a Zionist, not only in sort of like, what is justice, but it was really like, this is my nation, I need to identify with it, right? Strangely enough, in 1950, this is basically 30 years later, when he went to Israel and spoke, he spoke in Hebrew, and somebody afterwards said, amazing that a British non-Jewish person could speak Hebrew so well. He'd become he turned into like a cliche of a British professor. But he also had kind of, his own identity had shifted a little bit, he'd become really a British guy. He hadn't lost his sense of his identity, but his own national identity had become British in a very powerful way, right? Much perhaps like some of us would say, feel powerfully American, right? He recognized that. I mean, he chuckled at that and he recognized it. And he was able to say that, yeah, things can change. He has this very interesting line where even though he's so proud of still speaking Hebrew and he wants to retire to Israel and he still identifies with it, he says, I can imagine a situation where Israel, like every country, eventually becomes less Jewish and less national and less nation and more state. So if he were around today, he'd probably be one of those people who said, let's put the emphasis more on Israel as democracy. And if we feel a tension, because 20% of our population in Israel is not Jewish, if we feel a tension, we should lean towards less Jewish, right? So he would say, in other words, that nations are dynamic and that identities are dynamic, and that's okay. That wasn't a threat to him. What mattered most for him was something which we haven't seen happen, which was a world where every people does get a state, right? And if you're building a system and you have unequal, not in terms of power even, but in terms of units, right? Where do the Kurds fit in, right? There's all kinds of conflicts. Yeah. What do you do? And what do you have a state which begins to break apart? So that, yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And maybe that doesn't work anymore. Maybe the paradigms don't work because look at Iraq. It's really hard to just stick people together in a state. And therefore, do you have to build a new national identity to make it stick? And there's some people in Israel who are trying to do this, saying, can we build a national identity, not a binational state, not a one-state solution, but can we think about civic identity in Israel as something that really unites different parts of the population into something, right? I want to respond to Panina's question. Panina, you're up at the top of my screen, right? About Palestinian human rights. Right. Hi there. Palestinian human rights. So I thought a lot about this question, and here I want to share something with you that is a nice chance for me as somebody who wrote a book to talk to people who haven't read the book, which is that I didn't get it all right. I wanted to tell the story, the Jewish story in this, and I focused on that. I could have written a book which compared this to the Palestinian experience and looked at it. And so I've done some more writing since then about, more specifically, what did these people think about Palestinian human rights? And I have two answers. The answer I gave in the book is they just assume that there's going to be a two-state solution. Much like many of us assumed, or some of us still assume, that that's the best outcome. So when they looked at the conflict, they say, absolutely, we have to respect the human rights of every person under Israeli control, and the Israeli military, if it goes somewhere else, it should respect the human rights of those people, which doesn't just mean their rights to language, but equality. But his assumption is there's going to be a Palestinian state next door. The Jordanians are going to wake up and build a state there because there's so many Palestinians living in Jordan, and that doesn't happen. So he assumes that, and most of the people assume that. Now, there's a second answer, and I don't think I gave this answer as clearly in the book as I could have. And the answer is he's blind. He's strangely blind to what we could call Palestinian national identity. Like many Zionists at the time, he respects actually Arab national identity, but he doesn't differentiate between Palestinians and a pan-Arab nationalism. And so he says, and I do talk about this in the book, he says, of course there should be an Arab state, but he doesn't say that means the Palestinians should have their own state. He's willing to give it to them, but he doesn't imagine Palestinian national identity quite the same way it becomes, and also the way other people see it at the time. So the questions that we have today about collective identity and what would it mean for Palestinians who live as Arab Israeli citizens to make claims, he was blind to that. And I think that's characteristic of many people. In some respects, one of the great ironies of this story is that it's the liberal Zionists who don't see a lot of those issues as they're developing, and it's conservative Zionists, it's the right wing, Jabotinsky, who sees actually before 1940, before he dies, sees that there are claims of Arabs to national identity and what we would call human rights that need to be addressed. That's a kind of weird thing about it today that we can look back on. So long story short, he didn't see it all. And his answer is an answer that didn't work anymore after 1948, when you didn't have that country next door and Palestinians began to say, no, we don't want to just be Jordanian or part of Syria. We want to be something else back there or somewhere, right? So that's the question, Panina. Maybe we should, Jake, maybe we should just take one more question, and then I'll let you guys get a little break and cool it, and I'll go figure out why my 3 screaming kids have stopped screaming suspiciously.
I hear that.
It's many of you probably have siblings outside the door too, or pets or parents or others.
Thank you. I see a question from Simone. Simone, you want to talk?
Simone, please. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I was just wondering, I find it often like really unproductive when talking about sort of like minority rights considering Jews to like discuss Israel. And I feel like there are a lot of organizations that are out there that are specifically like looking at from a Jewish perspective, like social justice, but like we don't discuss Israel at all. Do you believe that it's possible to have that conversation without acknowledging the
Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah,
it's a wonderful question, Simone. I'll tell you, I understand the need to be able to say, look, there's an immediate issue of social justice here, right? And we need to address it. And I also understand that there are cynical and I think ideological activists and forces who want to hijack every forum, especially when it comes to progressive social justice, and kind of, say, we can't talk about anything else, right? Or you don't, or there's a litmus test. And those are pretty, I think there's a pretty deplorable phenomena when you see that happening. I personally don't think we can really ultimately separate it and just say, we're gonna cut it out and say it doesn't exist. What we can do, and what I've seen productive situations where people say, like, we're going to agree to disagree, right? We're going to put our cards on the table, and then we're going to move forward. But I don't think we can completely divorce ourselves from it and say, you can treat this differently. And I think that's because some of it is just politics, which is pressuring Jews and using Jews. But I'll be honest with you, I think it's also because other people out there come with complex identities and bring that with them into it in ways, just as we might say, we might react to saying that an attack on Israel could feel like an attack on us, could feel anti-Semitic. And there are other people who could say that events happening in Gaza and conflicts there can affect them too. So I think there has to be a way to acknowledge it. We can't just dismiss it and say, it'd be nice to be totally local. But that doesn't have to mean we can only, drop everything, right? I see this a lot. I actually think a lot of the bark is worse than the bite when it comes to it. I mean, I spend a lot of time at academic conferences talking about Zionism and human rights. I spent a year on college campuses traveling around speaking about this. And I found when you put your commitments on the table and you say, here's what I want to talk about, it was much more possible to have a principled dialogue about these things than it might appear from the media, and even from some of the, even some of the organizations that I support and I value, and I believe in, can get a little too distracted by it. So I'm an optimist about this, but I don't think we can push it out completely. We can bound it and say, okay, on this we pause and turn here. The biggest trap I observe, and I write about this in the book for earlier generations of American Jewish leaders, the biggest trap is those who pretend it's not an issue and then say, wait a second, why are people suddenly talking about it, right? And there are really great people in this book, and today, leaders who say, like, I'm shocked that people are bringing this up, right? And I've seen in many cases, and many really wonderful colleagues, professors, Hillel leaders, rabbis, who often say, we don't have a problem with that issue here. And they're not actually sort of looking around to see whether there are people who are strongly concerned about it. And then it comes up to just bump up seemingly out of nowhere. So I think a proactive response can be as important to dealing with this as sort of wishful pushing it away and saying, I just want to talk about the environment without it, And it's not necessarily fair. I mean, it's not fair. I would say to you and to anybody here who cares about social justice, it's not fair that we should have to always be speaking to that issue. It's an unfair burden, but it's also an opportunity for us to, think about this reality, which frankly, by the time all of us, in 5 years, Pakistan and India are going to be college campus issues. We know it because of things happening. China, these are going to be issues because there are more, Jews, again, our experience, our immigrant experience, our blended identity experience is one which is becoming only more common to people who live transnationally with family, and communities of origin in other places with strong commitments about countries they identify with and may feel tension with at the same time. So I don't think that we can escape it, but I think that burden is something that we can be, a unique opportunity to help shape things for the better. So there, I'm trying to end on an optimistic note.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
It really is an optimistic note. It was a good question to end on.
Great question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim.
Yeah.
A real pleasure to hear from you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank all of you for coming. Good luck with the rest of the program today, and happy to be in touch if anybody wants to.
Great.
Okay.
Take care.
So long.
Thank you.
So much.
All right, folks, short break.